Abolition is for Everybody is a podcast that tackles the sometimes difficult conversations around prison abolition. I'm Ra.
I'm Adam.
And I'm Crystal. In this season of Abolition Address for Everybody, we will talk about harm.
What creates it, what recycles it, and how we can find our way to meaningful means of repair.
Just a reminder, friends, in this episode and every episode, we dive into very sensitive issues. This season is frameworks around violence. And though the title of this episode may give you some warning, remember that harm itself tends to create situations of alternate harms. There will probably be other painful topics brought up too. Take care of you.
Well, hey, Graham, welcome. It's nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the time and being willing to do this. This season is all about harm, which is super rough to talk about. But this specific episode is called Abolition Address Robbery. Can you tell our listeners why you specifically are here?
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Graham Finochio. My pronouns are he, him, his. In 2005, I'd been out of prison off of a DUI parole violation for 12 days. While I was in prison, I had written to someone who's close to me, and they wrote me back and told me about a situation where they were hurt. They were beat up and robbed by their boyfriend. I'd spent the relationship with this person. I'd spent the entire relationship in like a protectorate role. So I immediately thought, I'm going to get this person. That was the lifestyle that I lived at that time. And so I'm going to get this person at some point. And 12 days out of this parole violation, I worked all day. I walked into a bar and lo and behold, this individual was sitting at the bar. I didn't know him personally, but I recognized him from pictures she had sent me. So I went through the process of figuring out a way to hurt him. I plotted a way to get him outside, had conversations with him, pulled him outside. And my co-defendant, which means someone who was arrested with me ultimately, coaxed him into a back alley behind this bar. And I commenced to really laying into him and hurting him pretty severely. I took everything that he owned off of his persons, all of his clothes except for underwear, wallet, shoes, the cigarette he was smoking, some really like ridiculous. I thought I was making a point. And so that's what I did. I made him count backwards from 100 and we ran. I went back to my co-defendant's house, showered. There was blood on me, so I washed the blood off. I went to the store to get cigarettes with my co-defendant thinking it was fine. The cops in Huntington Beach knew me, so they stopped immediately. The victim, the survivor, identified me. Didn't identify my co-defendant, and I was taken in for a parole violation, which they used to do back then. And then I noticed that he was a very quiet person. So I noticed his lips were moving very fast, and I found out that he was telling the cops everything that took place. And so I was charged with attempted murder and robbery. And after fighting the case for about 2 years, a year and 8 months, I was offered a plea. I was at jury selection. A plea, it's copping out. A plea basically means that they are offering you a lesser sentence to get you to sign and plead guilty at that moment. They offered me a 15-year plea. I told my lawyer previously that at any point I would take 10 or below, because I know at a 21-year-old person, I was involved in gangs. I was a skinhead. I was involved in white supremacist gangs. A 21-year-old person of my posture and attitude is going to end up with a life sentence with anything more than 10 years. And I might end up with it then, just based on the culture of what happens in prison. And I was offered a plea bargain, the 15 years. It was right after I'd selected the first two jurors, or me and my lawyer had selected the first two jurors. I very quickly signed. And at that point I decided, I'm never going to go home. It is what it is. I'm just going to go to prison. I don't have anything out here anyways. And I made my way to prison. And the plea was for robbery, second-degree robbery, 211.
Makes sense. Thank you for sharing all that, and particularly for defining the words. I think sometimes it's so easy to, these experiences are so common once you've been incarcerated that they just become as normal of words as the way people would describe their bedding or, household items. So I really, really appreciate that. And it looked like Crystal had a comment, so I'll.
Graham, you talk a lot about the harms that you caused that particular night. And you said that you went through this process of thinking like how you would hurt this person if you were to run into them. Can you share a little bit more about what that was like for you and what that's like for you now after many many years of healing and doing the work that you currently do?
Sure. So that's an interesting question because from a very young age, visualization has been a tool that I used. When I was in a lifestyle where I was doing harm to other people, I could picture in my head exactly what I would want to do. And then I would take steps so that that would be the result. And still, I mean, I would be dishonest if I said that that doesn't take place now. If someone cuts me off, some visualization goes off in my head. If I get mad at someone for doing something that I think is rude or disrespectful, there's visualization. And it was kind of an escape when I was younger, and I began to use it as a weapon as I got older, if that makes sense.
An escape from what?
So I grew up in Orange County, California. There's a lot of misconceptions about Orange County. People think, oh, it's like the TV show. It's not necessarily all like the TV show, just certain parts. And I didn't grow up in those parts. My family, I was raised by my grandmother and my father. My mother was absentee, in and out of the picture. They both were in and out of prison, addicted to heroin. My father was very, very abusive. I experienced a lot of different levels and types of abuse: sexual, physical, emotional, verbal abuse as a kid. And my escape was in my mind. I wasn't also very social as a kid. I was a very small kid. And I was a white kid in an area that didn't have a lot of white kids going to that school. So I got, called names. I had a lisp that doesn't go over well in school. My grandma was English, and I was taught to talk from her. So I had like a half English accent. I sounded very strange. And so I often didn't talk,
Right.
and I would play with my dog or play by myself and play in my imagination. So that was the escape that I was looking for.
I hear you talk about the visualization of how things played out, and I can relate to that, right? And when I was able to really understand what it was, OCP, which I'm sure you're familiar with, obsession, compulsion, and progression. I'm interested to know, like, knowing that you have grown up and you have went through this system, how was you able to kind of, break that cycle of thinking with obsession, compulsion, and progression, and knowing that it's absolutely no resources in prison?
It took a long time. And the reason it took a long time was, it often involves a choice by the individuals to begin recognizing the harmful behaviors. And as you mentioned, there's no tools in prison. Prisons aren't setting up groups and having you take groups or like agendizing things that you need to do so you can work on yourself, or mandating therapy. None of those things happen in prison. And I would be surprised to find someone who says that was their experience in at least California prison, if not all prisons. And so I entered prison thinking, as I mentioned to Raw earlier, I mentioned prison expecting to stay. I didn't have a life sentence, but I would do the things that put me in a position to excel within the gang culture inside,
right?
Climb the ladder, so to speak. And I would do those things, and I would climb, and I would get into a position of power, and I'd have, whatever merit, whatever degree of like respect from the people that are around me. And that took, 12 and a half years, multiple SHU terms. I spent 8 years within my incarceration within the SHU, or within administrative segregated housing, which is the hole. For folks that don't know, the hole in the SHU is like prison within prison. You're super secluded. You have like zero access to anything. Right. You have one appliance. You're shackled every time you come out your cell.
Isolation.
Yes, absolutely. Which heals nothing. There's zero, like, that doesn't do anything. It's a punitive measure that does nothing. And I spent the majority of my time like that. And I think like the first steps towards transformation came just based on age. At the age of 30, between 30 and like 33, I started just like not wanting to be aggressive anymore. I was tired. I'd get hurt a lot more easily because I was older. And also, like, I just didn't have like the degree physiologically, like the degree of testosterone running through my body that I did when I was in my 20s. I didn't, and I'd already proven myself on so many levels within that culture that I'm like, I'm not going to keep fighting for people's approval for my whole life. So part of the step away was that. That didn't mean I stepped away from everything. It just meant like, I thought, okay, well, I can just be one of the older guys in prison, and that'll be fine. And then I ended up going to this prison in Soledad, which is in Central Valley, called CTF. It was a level 2. I'd spent 2 years when I got kicked out of the SHU on a level 3, and then my points dropped and I went to a level 2, and that was Soledad. And I got to tell you, man, like I hated it there. I hated that prison because there were so many people talking about good stuff, like people talking about causative factors, people talking about healing, like listening to one another. And that just wasn't
active listening.
Absolutely. And like there was, probably 30 to 40 groups, excluding even like NA or AA and educational programs. And I learned from being there that these were things that the people at the prison had designed, developed, and put into play. Not the guards, not the counselors, not the psychologists, the people in the prison or community-based organizations were putting into motion within this prison. And like I said, I hated it at first, but as I'd walk laps on this huge yard, because Soledad has like the biggest yard in CDCR, it's massive. I'd walk laps and I'd hear people talking and my ears would perk, and I'd start getting drawn into these conversations as I met people in my wing, and I'd talk the way that I had always talked about who knows who, and what's happening over here, what yards are good, what yards aren't good, who on the streets did what kind of dirt.
Right, the normal gossip.
Yeah, there was no reception. Like these older folks that were in like mostly serving life that were in the wing with me were saying like, now let's talk about like the why. Let's talk about what happened to get you to the point where you think this is important. And I didn't realize how much of a shift that was until I started engaging in conversation with folks like that. So over the course of 2.5 years, I was in that prison for 4 years. And over the course of 2.5 years, I began attending a group here to get out of my cell because I was on C status. C status is restriction while you're on the main line. So it's like they take your TV, you have nothing, you're stuck in your cell.
Right,
Punishment. And so I began like using groups to get out of my cell. And, I'm a social person nowadays. And so I started getting engaged in the conversations and really weaning some benefit. Now, that didn't mean that I was taking necessary steps. It just meant that like I was starting to learn that the things I was doing were not healthy, were not okay, and weren't helping anybody.
I'm really glad you brought up age. That is a big discussion point in the work we do with abolition, as you know, because people do age out of crimes. That is a real thing. And robbery is very often caused specifically by youth. Desperation, being poor, and being mentally ill. And when you start really looking at those causative factors, the way we respond to it seems less and less reasonable. I just did it now, I realized, and so did a few of us, or a few of the other hosts but we mentioned what you do now and why you would know these things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So kind of trailing back on the story, at about 2.5 years, I started attending a lot of groups. I began attending college. I was like expanding my mindset. I felt like I was rebelling against what the system was designed to do by doing these things. Like I was digging into myself, which they tell you to not, you have to always be concerned and be shamed by the stuff that you've done before. And that, like I said, I didn't like step away from everything. I was still political in the yard. I ended up catching this case, which means a new case inside, like a new arrest for drug distribution. And they took me to the hole, and I'd been attending NA and AA, and that had opened some doors in terms of accountability. Like the fifth step, basically the fourth and fifth step are all about accountability. You find the areas where you were harmed, what you felt, then you identify your part. And through that process,
this is in a Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, right?
Yes. Any 12-step program utilizes a similar mechanism.
Okay.
So that accountability measure of the fourth step, an area where you were harmed, the emotions that you felt from that, and then walk you into what is your part in this. I began to realize I had a very active part in a lot, whether it be dishonesty, whether it be like there's a whole list of different measures that it could have been. And I began to realize that, but albeit I went to the hole, and I sat in the hole on a 4-month SHU term, literally the shortest SHU term that I've ever done, the shortest time in hole I'd ever done. And I was just destroyed. I was isolated. They kept me in a cell by myself. They had me on a tier where I had no one I could communicate with. And I just sat in that cell and tore myself apart with using this 4-step mechanism. And I say tear myself apart because quite literally, it felt as if I was ripping myself apart. It's not like a clean cut. It's not a mechanic. Like it doesn't just, it's very, very roughshod. So I began unpacking some of the trauma by myself, and I made a resolution that like, I know what I'm doing isn't working. Right. I know that it's not serving the people that I love. I know that it's not serving the goals that I actually want in life, which over the 2.5 years I had identified. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go back to the yard I was on, which is very hard to make happen. Sometimes they transfer your points of race. I'm going to step away from the gang culture that I was deeply embedded in at that time. I'm going to do so on the yard openly so that other people can see that that is something that's doable. And I'm going to attend every group I can. I'm going to reverse the time I lost. I just began digging in. And it's the first time that I'd done something like that for myself. I understand robbery is an act of harm. But I think that it's very important to emphasize that harm, like what we do, our actions are a form of communication, not just our words, not just our body language, but the things that we do are another form of language. Absolutely. And the language that I'd been living in had just discarded myself as something that was had no value. And in that cell, I began to see that, be as it may that I'm in prison and that I did harm, I have value and I can contribute something. And so I continued that path for the next 18 months, beat the case in court, literally based on the work that I was doing. Like they said, okay, we're going to dismiss the case because you're creating news, you're doing stuff within this community, and we want to just dismiss this. It was phenomenal. And I ended up going home on February 10th of 2019.
You said something that kind of triggered me that I would like to kind of ask you to share on a little bit, is when you talked about, growing up and things that happen in behavior and stuff. And would you say it's safe to say like a lot of the trauma that you experience, you have adopted in some sort of way to kind of like act that up on others, especially like, getting that call and, you get that call and you already visualizing. Do you think that came from some of the things that you have witnessed?
I think so. So one of the areas I identify in other work that I do is like targeting patriarchy. And I think that the patriarchal expectation that was placed on me by my father created a set of tapes in my head that said, I have to do this. Like there is no other way.
Right, this false belief system.
Exactly. This is what men do. This is the why. The why is a super like a box with a hollow bottom. There's really no clear answer. And I have to do these things. And, as a kid who was like beaten severely, sexually abused, the value that I felt for myself at a young age was non-existent. And then moving forward, there's this key point in my life where I came home. I was in a fight with an argument with my dad. I'd been out of the house for several months. I came home, we get in an argument. He lays into me, literally just smashes my head into an open dishwater. The spikes cut into my face. I run to my room. I grab this Nerf hockey stick. I haven't played hockey in a day in my life. Don't even know why I had that hockey stick. And I waited by the door. I could hear him barreling down the hallway. I waited by the door and I swung, fully intending to not hit him, fully intending to hit the doorway of the room directly across the hallway to stop him from coming at me. And I missed. I hit him right in the face. And he looked like it broke his nose, blood all over the walls. I bailed out my window. I knew my father was going to kill me. He's going to murder me for this. But I also felt like redemption at that point, which is a strange thing to say. I felt like I had empowered myself through violence. And I used that continually through the rest of my life to say, oh, violence is language that I know. It's simple enough. And that's how I lived the next 25 years of my life, was embedded in violent gang activity. I felt like I found my manhood in that moment.
Right.
Which is complete nonsense, but that's what because of all the messaging around patriarchal expectations, when I took a violent action, I was rewarded with freedom. I was free from the house. I could do what I want. I had a story to tell people to get more.
Right. That respect, that false respect.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. And I like how you explained that because, it led up to the point of, what happened that night. But more importantly, it's something that you said that I would like to kind of just get a little bit more insight on, is when you talked about like prison and how they don't have things designed or set up. And it's up to, the loved ones inside that kind of want to take that initiative to do better. Like how has been the transition from knowing like the limited resources in that prison gives us, and it's absolutely nothing, to being able to come home and have that space?
So I still go into prisons to deliver a program, and they are still difficult. I want to point out that like when we did set up programs in prison, the administration does everything, and this isn't I feel safe to assume that every prison does this. The administration set barriers in play to stop us from doing so.
For sure.
You can't have this space during this time.
Right.
You can only have these people. This person can't go. Exactly. And so those restrictions impeded, but I was in the lucky position, the advantageous position at CTF to have so many groups that it was almost as if the administration couldn't stop it, although they probably very well could. And out here, the culture has shifted a lot. There's more openness to community-based response, not as much as I'd like, but there is within community organizations, group homes, domestic violence organizations. They identify that the system isn't working as it is, and that it's lacking something. And they believe, and I believe, that what it's lacking is that dialogue, that deep, vulnerable dialogue that you and I could have within a group setting that everybody has the opportunity to grow from.
Graham, you're able to trace back what happened that night to your childhood, and now you're able to identify it as, patriarchy. And as I was thinking about you coming today, another aspect I'd like to highlight is the systems that you were talking about, and these systems that we have set up, where a lot of people go and commit robberies out of desperation and for survival. I have a loved one who has an addiction, and I know a lot of the times they go out and rob to feed that addiction. I have a cousin who suffers from substance abuse and has schizophrenia. I remember as I was a young girl, like his father coming to my house all the time and asking my dad for help. And not that long ago, he went and robbed a store and just scared everybody in there. And now they're threatening him to give him 25 to life. And I often, I always think about the times in my childhood that I saw his father come, and I always think about what could be done differently. We never talk about these systems of desperation that we've set in place. We're like, oh, 25 to life, well, that's too bad, but he shouldn't have stolen that store, but we never talk about that before. So I just wanted to highlight those stories as we talk about how abolition addresses robberies.
Absolutely. And I fully agree with what you said. I think so something I don't think I expanded on earlier is the fact that I grew up poor, and my experience of life was there's the haves and the have-nots. I had significant advantage that I wasn't seeing at that time because of my whiteness, but poverty level, certain life experiences, that was not my privilege. And so I thought that there was just a group of people who had all the kids at school that had all the nice stuff, and there was us, my sister, myself, my family. And at an early age, I was stealing. This robbery that was much less a robbery than a physical act of violence was not the first time I'd taken someone's stuff. I had taken stuff because I wanted it. I remember many occasions in my life where I was like, I need that, I'll take it. And it just became an issue of access. And that's not to justify my actions, but at a young age, what kind of thinking around consequential thinking would I have that would tell me that this is wrong if I'm getting a payoff from it?
Right. That gratification from it.
Absolutely. And so at that point, I wasn't thinking about what it would cost me if I got caught, which I did many times. I was thinking around the payoff of having it right then. Right. The fact that I had something that I wouldn't have been able to obtain otherwise.
I talked a little bit on the podcast before about how I was raised really differently than a lot of people in this community, certainly very differently from most formerly incarcerated people, in that we were on the side of the haves. And a couple things that struck me in your story was early on, you said that the cop knew you, and just the level of over policing that takes in a neighborhood for a single cop to recognize really anyone, and the areas that they go is just indicative of another trauma that your life was facing every single day, just knowing that you were being patrolled just for living, really. And then also Crystal mentioned your visualization technique, which in communities of haves, I should say, they that's a huge asset, and in children, that is something that would have been found out, selected, taught to do exactly what you do now, which is lead and heal, because those are the skills necessary to take someone from an idea to a possibility. And I wanted to bring those up because those are the types of resources we could be providing. And those are the types of direct actions we could take that might minimize that type of situation. And also because there are resources in those communities. We often think about abolition as providing resources towards that community. But there is so much that those communities can bring to us. It brought us you, right? So that's a huge asset that came from this community that we as a society have, I guess, forsaken under the label of what Crystal called systems of desperation. And I just think that should be said, that you came out of there anyway. So
Yeah, I like the way that you framed that. And like, just as patriarchy and toxic masculinity oversimplify masculinity, and they make it seem like it's these 4 things or 3 things and one result, emotionlessness. Right. The same thing happens with harm. We utilize punishment. It oversimplifies justice. It oversimplifies, oh, this person hurt someone. They need to be hurt. Right. We're going to take them, lock them away, ship them to some remote place, have guns on them, take all their liberties. And the arbitrary amount of time is what will fix this. 15 years, 25 years, 40 years, 150. That will fix this because they're healing. The people who are harmed, they're healing. And they have an opportunity to make a different decision. Yeah. But the amount of shame that goes into that process from court all the way through for the person almost negates the opportunity of healing, right? So many times in my life, I've allowed the tapes that are playing in my head from things that I've been told about myself to steer. And it wasn't something that's happened and now better. Like, it's still something I work through today. Also, the survivors are offered zero healing. There is zero that is provided by the state for folks who are harmed. And that's a really interesting point, because I paid 55% of every dollar that went in my books to those survivors, and they ain't getting a thing.
Zero support. Right. Now, I like how you touched on something that I want to kind of expand on as well, is when you talk about, somebody that is going through the system, right, going through the county jails. And it's even more like violence and different things is even more perpetuated, right? Especially if you are involved in any kind of lifestyle that's related to gang culture,
I think what takes place, the reason that gang culture is so prevalent in prison isn't just because people who are in gangs are getting arrested. It's a leveling. They take everything from this group of people. When you get off the bus, they divide you by race. They divide you potentially by age or by region. They house you with people of the same a cultural background and the same age group. That's the standard that they hold for that. And everybody's leveled at a level of nothingness because you have almost zero access to anything. So they group you with people who you identify as. And if you're a gang member, you're like, how can I make this shitty ass situation better? I'm going to have some stuff. So I'm going to sell drugs. I'm going to make sure that nobody can harm me because it's a very aggressive environment. So I'm going to harm first. I'll get off first. Simple as that.
Or even robberies, right? Even robberies that still takes place from just being inside, between the have and the have nots, right? Which is another example of it's being perpetuated, and how come this is continuing to happen and continuing to be this separation,
For sure. And CDCR they've taken measures recently, and I think they're following blueprints from other states of like an NDPF model, which is basically programming yards where you can go and program and there's no gang activity, versus general population yards or SMY yards where there is still gang activity and there might not be as many programs. And I think it's very important to address the fact that reforming the culture of prison doesn't solve anything. Violence still takes place on these yards. Aggression still takes place. It's not really solving anything as much as it's just dividing people further and making CDCR look fluffy and nice. And that's not really the case. If you were to take all of the harm that happens to a person who's incarcerated out of prison, the guards, the guns, the weapons, the cells, the restriction of property, the distance from home, if you took all of that out, you'd have a treatment center or a mental health facility. All of that taken out, you don't have prisons at all anymore.
It's a culture of violence, and you put people in that culture of violence, and of course that exists still. I think obviously I'm speaking to the women's prisons experience, and I know our breakup of gangs is kind of fundamentally different than how it shows up in men's prisons. But one thing that struck me early on is in my time was that I kind of felt like people clung so strongly to their gang culture because it was a culture, which is something you're allowed to keep. They take everything else away from you and you're allowed to keep this one community. And yes, it's a community where the language is violence, but that violence is born out of a understood need for things and an understood respect and valuing of certain people. Like, even when you were telling your story, you were talking about how you were like a protector figure in someone's life. And I found that a lot with the women I knew who were in gangs, that they were the protector in people's lives. And so this community provided them language and tools for that. And we never supplant that with anything different. And I think in prisons, and this kind of like brings us to like what we're trying to address in this season, which is like what heals us in prison. And of course, it's not the prison, but it is those communities. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on how those communities form or how we could do them outside of this like forced environment.
I think like one thing we do within our work, just addressing language, instead of asking what's wrong with that person, ask what happened to that person. I think that's a very powerful shift in language. Because as I said, like actions is a form of communication. Our behavior is a form of communication. So what is this person saying when they do this?
Right.
And I think that invitation, the first time I felt human was in the groups that I was in the prison I was at. And every time I left those groups, this is why I did 6 hours of groups a day, plus college, plus the work that they require you to do, was because
Incredible.
yeah, I was hungry for someone to just listen and hear. Like I wanted to be heard. And through that, I learned to hear other people. And through that, I built a community of people that hold each other accountable, who are still my friends today, that are out of prison for the most part, that are still my friends today. And so I think just hearing people, hearing what they say and asking yourself, what are they really communicating through this action or through these aggressive undertones or overtones?
What were you communicating, Graham? I don't know if that's too much of a deep or heavy question, but looking back at your young self, like what do you think you were communicating maybe that night or,
I was communicating insecurity, deep embedded insecurities and fears and not being enough. And at a young age, I'd set rules on my refrigerator. These are my chores, Grandma, Dad. These are the things I have to do. I wanted some sort of structure in my life because I was free to do what I wanted. And I never got that. I got in a fight in second grade, my first fight in school, and I was suspended. My dad got me in the car, smacked me very, very hard in the face. It was quiet, a very quiet car ride home. We turned the corner. The first thing he says is, "Did you win?" And that put an emphasis on the fact that, like, if I'm not winning, I'm losing. Like that, I'm going to have to win because I don't have the tools. I don't have access to the things I need. I'm going to win however I can with what I've got.
Yeah. And then you learned that maybe like harming someone and getting away with it, or maybe not getting away with it that one time, was winning.
Yeah. And I think more, it was less about the actions. I'd compromised my value scale by this point. At 21 years old, my value scale was just based on acceptance. All the while telling myself, like, I'm a free person. I don't give a crap what this person thinks of me. I'm an individual. I do what I want. But I lived 25 years seeking other people's acceptance through this transactional lens. Like, what you can do for me makes you of value to me. And so I'll be close to you. And it was very dehumanizing for me. And it took a lot to realize that.
Graham, that's one thing that, as I got into this abolition work, that I think about often is how to get folks to think about the why, like the why behind the behavior. What is that person trying to communicate with us, with the harm that they may be causing? There's this one story that I read that stuck with me with the Mal that I read, that he talked about struggling a lot in life and going and robbing, some bread or some money off of the cashier in the front, and how he was caught, and that was like his second or third strike, I believe, and he's in prison now for the rest of his life, for over some cash from the register and a loaf of bread. And every time I think about that story, and my 8-year-old nephew, I remember one time he overheard me telling that story to my sister, and he just was in complete disbelief that this person was spending the rest of his life in prison because he was hungry enough to go steal some bread and some money from the cash register. And that's one thing that I often think about in communicating with my loved ones or with non-abolitionists in my world, is thinking about the why. Like, what is this person communicating with us? Like, this person was hungry and he stole some bread, and now he's in prison for the rest of his life, going through even more trauma and more harm and being away from his family.
Yeah, that's severe. And I think that, like, the public as a whole, especially non-abolitionist folks, are told, like, this is the solution. This is what we've got.
Yeah.
They don't discuss the money that goes into that system. They don't just discuss the statistics with a recidivism rate anywhere between 60 and 80%, which is, if you take 10 people that have been to prison, line them up on the wall, 6 to 8 of those people are going back based on numbers. So it's not working. And I think that people just think, or rather don't think. Maybe it's about not not really having any desire to think about that uncomfortable subject of like, hey, this thing we're putting billions of dollars into doesn't work. Like, it's not serving the purpose that it's telling us it's serving.
Out of sight, out of mind, right? And you're told you're safer. This person who stole this loaf of bread shouldn't have stolen, and you're safer by him being away in prison for 25 years.
Absolutely.
Part of that is just like not doing the cultural work, right? Like, what are the values of this country? Are things more important than people? You know, these are questions that people just don't ask themselves. And we see that a lot currently in the media with all these like rising, I'm in air quotes because I know listeners can't see me. Yes, there are so many situations where things are being like stolen from stores, and they're blown into these articles that include raising criminal charges across the board, undoing a lot of the work we've done in this space to get people home sooner, to get them the resources they need. And ultimately what that messaging is, when you vote that way, abolitionist or not, you're saying that things are more important than people. And is that a value you really want to hold, you know? And I don't know if like you can speak to like when you were a youth, you said there was a lot of like smaller robberies that you may or may not have gotten caught on. Like, did you have that sense growing up that things were like one of the most important things to have?
Absolutely. Because I mean, if you take from someone else, the emphasis is made through the punishment you receive. You know, in fourth grade, I don't know if y'all remember in school, they had the photos, the pictures that they took every year, and they'd come in this big manila envelope thing, and they'd have the pictures. So back then, credit cards existed, but parents were putting money in those envelopes. So I walked by the school office with this kid that I was going to school with. It was after hours, and the little sliding window of the school office is open. I didn't get to take pictures that year. I didn't have money for pictures. And I saw these pictures, and I grabbed them out the window and took the money. And the wrath that they brought down on me for doing, I was expelled. I was sent to a different school. And really what I think I was communicating is that I was hurt that I didn't have those pictures. Definitely taking that money I bought a whole bunch of stuff from Sanrio for two girls that I liked that were in my class. And that was what I did with the money. It wasn't even for me, but I wanted to be able to do that. And I didn't have the access to it.
And their solution was, let's expel him and move him schools and move him away from all of his friends, which is, you know, it's similar to what happens now, where there are systems that we create in which people find themselves needing to rob in order to survive, or, you know, do what they have to do. And then when they get caught, we punish them for it. It's like we set them up, and then they're out here trying to survive. And it's just like punitive. You're going to prison now. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, doesn't at all. Yeah, it doesn't at all.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what you shared with that story, because I mean that takes another look, a deeper look, should I say, about you know, what do we have in place, right? And me answering that question and kind of just using your scenario, which I can identify with, because I remember, you know, doing some stuff and robbing, and that's me saying, hey, I don't have access. And instead of like, you know, me getting suspended and then I'm coming home and, you know, getting spanked and getting whoopings for it, right? It should have been, you know, you shouldn't be stealing, you shouldn't be doing this, but how about we try to give you some type of assignment so you can be able to work for it, than to say, hey, you know, since you stole this, we're going to expel you, you're going to get whooped, and, you know, this is how we do punishment. Like, I think that's why we do need to have things in place. And I mean, what would you say of what do we have in place?
I mean, at this point, and I'm not super clear on like in elementary school, I think at this point, more and more divesting from police organizations and prisons and the harm that takes place within those, and investing in community-based organizations has helped some communities, not to the degree that it could, nowhere near the degree that it could. They have domestic violence classes. They are it's evidence-based curriculum, but it's probably the most bland and unuseful tool that you could come up with. The same with DUI classes, everything along those lines. I think like an in-person connection is required, meaning like we have areas of identification, you and I, Adam, and we have areas where we don't identify.
Right.
And in levels of harm that both of us have a common ground standing on, having us in community together to work through that stuff and identify where the harmful behavior comes from is needed. And that isn't what we get right now. That's not what's happening right now, but it's a much more common sense approach. Abolition is a much more common sense approach to the humanity of everyone around us. We take that objectification approach. This isn't a human. After they do this is after I stole that stuff from the school, I was the kid who breaks into the school from that point on. That was always the stigma that I had. After I went to prison, I was always the convict or the former inmate or the former criminal.
The label stays.
Right. Labeling. Right. Thank you for answering that. I just like to ask, reflecting on everything that's been said that you discussed today, do you think it's something you may want to add on to, or something that we have missed, or something you might want to reflect on?
I don't know if it's something that was missed or that I didn't. I probably talked at length about this subject, but I think it's important. I really want to emphasize the fact that prisons are doing exactly what they're intended to do, and it's not working for the purpose that they are telling us. And what I mean by that is it houses and warehouses people, gets them to do the work for them, gets them to feel less human about themselves. If I could give you a list of the stuff that a guard has told me about me, my person, when they don't even know anything about me except my C file, add that to the tapes I got as a kid. By the time I came out of prison, like everything was stacked against me. The likelihood of me going home was slim to none, right? Because even if I wanted to go home, I didn't believe that I was worthy of going home, that I would do good, that I could do anything in life except what I'd been doing before. And that's all from the voices of other people, which in my insecurity, I needed that approval. I needed that acceptance from other people. Even if it's some stupid guard on a wing, like, tell me that I'm coming back the day I parole. That's some terrible stuff to do to a person.
Yeah.
Right, very harmful. Verbal abuse, like, is one of the key things that takes place in prison on an everyday basis. I mean, even with somebody just getting mail, and they may say your last name and say, "Oh, you finally got a letter today." Like, that can be hurtful to somebody that may not get mail. So harm is always caused. And thank you for sharing that and pointing that out.
To end us with a little bit of hope, Graham, what is one tangible action that our listeners can take away from this episode?
One tangible action is, I think, the shift in language that I spoke of earlier, I think is super important. Instead of using these labels, monster, criminal, all of these terrible things that people call it, like, identify folks as humans and then ask what happened to them to lead to this. It leads to a degree of empathy on a personal level that can heal in the long term, that can build community. If I was to say something you could do communally, it would be talk to your neighbors, communicate with your neighbors. Like, who doesn't talk to in my experience, when I was growing up, I didn't talk to my neighbors. I didn't know the community I lived in, and I felt completely isolated. Communicating with your neighbors and the people around you, learning what their needs are, learning how you can support one another, allows you to build the community that prison and policing takes from us. It allows you to care about people outside of your immediate sphere.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Graham, about using people-centered language, and what you said earlier today. My tiny tangible thing for our listeners would be to think of the why, and like you said, Graham, think of what is that person trying to tell us with the behavior, the action that is happening. So instead of thinking right away of like the harm and what's happening, think of the why, think of the human, look at it through like an empathetic perspective.
I think for me, it would have to be hearing, right? As I was listening to your story, I noticed how you spoke about, being heard when you was able to get around a community that gave you that space, right? And being able to be heard and being able to speak, right? You was able to release what you was feeling, what you have kind of been bottling up, which you was able to kind of get some type of help and insight on where you can start to become better. You know what I'm saying? And I think that goes along with what you're saying, being in community, knowing your neighbors, being able to have that open door policy, as they call it, being able to speak and communicate,
Oh, that's totally true. And it's unusual to know your neighbors in most neighborhoods now. I'm always the odd one out when I come over with phone numbers and cookies, but I think it's important part of my self-work. I guess my tiny thing would be to just spend a couple minutes examining your cultures. Cultures aren't just things that exist on their own in a silo. They're things that are built by the people in them. And if there is something that you can do to make your culture a little kinder, a little more patient, and a little bit more prepared for the world that they're going to meet, I think, then that's a worthwhile couple minutes.
This isn't the full story of the full humans involved in these experiences, or every complete community or person who has gone through experiences that parallel. We have walked this gently so as not to diminish the story, but to highlight and amplify the hearts involved. For a safe discussion that goes further in a larger but more community-based space, please join us at Abolition Corner. For more information, visit initiatejustice.org/abolitioncorner.